What if you could re-rank the NFL 2020 draft based off of what each player got in their second contract? Because the first contract is determined by whenever they got picked on the rookie deal, but the second contract is determined by how much the team values the player. Well, that's exactly what Ben Baldwin posted about with this chart right here. Now, if each NFL team had a full pie of money to give out, that column right there represents what cut of each team's pie that player got for the season. In other words, the first thing that jumped out to me is that the quarterbacks were getting paid. But then this made me think about another question of, is this trend true across past years beyond just 2020? Like, are quarterbacks always getting paid? Are they always going to show up here? Because look at Ben Baldwin's other version of this, where he actually just put it in the original draft order, and you could see the quarterbacks looked like they were probably the best picks of the whole draft, based off of how much each team is valuing them in their second contract. So what if we scale this out for every NFL draft pick from 2010 all the way to 2020? Well, that's exactly what I did, so I'm going to walk through it in this video with you today. Let's first start with how we did this. I used over-the-cap salary data to pull every single first-round pick that was drafted between the 2010 NFL draft and the 2020 NFL draft. From there, we grabbed the second contract that each first-round pick got and then took it and did that same percentage of the team's cap for whatever year that person signed that contract. That will also help us compare a standardized version of the salary across years and salary caps, because obviously not only with like US inflation, but also the salary cap continues to rise. But in this video, we're gonna learn more than just whether or not this quarterback trend is real across all years, but what other positional trends we've found as well. But really, was that 2020 graph a total fluke, or is it a part of a broader trend that really backs up the statement that quarterback is the most important position in all of sports? Like, can we see that in the draft data? Well, first things first, let's take every single person drafted in our data set, group them by position, and put them on this chart right here. Now, I know you're seeing a lot, but each box is going to represent a position group. And the first thing I want you to look at, rather than the boxes, are the little thick lines between each box for each position group. That thick part in the middle is the median percentage of the salary cap that each position group got in their second contracts. So the typical percentage of the salary cap that running backs got on their second draft picks when they were drafted in the first round was this percentage right here, which is different than what the DNs got, which would be right here. Again, these are just median values. Now, the actual length of the box is determined by the spread between the first quartile and the third quartile. In other words, if you had 100 quarterbacks and you ranked them 1 to 100, if you grabbed person number 25 and person number 75, that would be those two ends of the box. And if you haven't already noticed it, look at how wide the range is for quarterbacks compared to every other position. But not only is the range wide between the 25th and 75th percentiles, but even if you look at the little whiskers, which are those little lines right there, those include all quarterbacks that don't qualify as an outlier. In other words, it's literally everybody else. And look at how wide that range is. In other words, the quarterbacks that do really, really well as far as getting paid for that second contract get paid more than anybody else, and the ones that suck, well, they don't get paid at all, just like everybody else. Now, what's interesting is while the quarterbacks have that really wide range of outcomes, this is sorted by descending typical percentage. In other words, the typical left tackle or the typical interior defensive lineman actually gets a bigger percentage of the salary cap in their second contracts than quarterbacks. But wait a second, I already know that you're doubting this chart because it's making two assumptions that I don't think are correct. First of all, it assumes that the typical left guard gets drafted as early in the first round as the typical quarterback, and that all positions get drafted evenly throughout the first round. And like, we both know that that's not the case, right? Like, when there's an elite left tackle or when there's an elite quarterback, they go in the top 5, and an elite center does not go in the top 5. An elite center might go in the middle of the first round or in the end of the first round because a team is able to justify that draft pick and say, hey, this guy's special. There's not a Quentin Nelson every single year, right? Well, right now we are just assuming that everybody gets drafted evenly in the first round. But the other thing that we're assuming incorrectly is that we right now are assuming that the first overall pick and the 32nd overall pick should be expected to get as much of a cut of that cap in their second contract, and that's probably not true. Like, here's a genuine question for you. For this upcoming 2025 NFL draft, if we grab whoever ends up being the first overall pick, the 10th overall pick, and the last pick in the first round, which one of those guys is most likely to take up the most of the team's cap 4 years from now when it gets that second deal. You're probably just going to rank it in order of draft position, right? The first overall pick's most likely to get paid, then the 10th overall pick, and then the 32nd. So we got to account for that in some way. So this is how we're going to do it. Just like we expected, the trend is true. The individuals that were picked in the top 5 of the draft tend to get a higher percentage of their team's salary cap in the second contract than the guys drafted later in the rounds. In other words, the guys at the top of the first round are getting paid a lot more frequently or a lot more on average than guys drafted at the end of the first round. And it's a pretty steep drop off, which we would expect. But now that we have a way to account for when somebody was drafted, is there a way to account for the typical time that that position gets drafted? And yes, we can check that as well. This chart is actually going to show the typical draft selection for first round picks by position. In other words, if you're a first round quarterback, you are most likely being drafted pretty early in the draft. We can't say the same about some of these later ones at the top of the chart. So this also kind of matches our expectations, right? Like, we know that quarterbacks get paid. We also know that people drafted early get paid. We also know that quarterbacks get drafted early. This is all kind of making sense, and I don't think I'm surprising you here. But what happens if we take that original plot and we actually adjust it based off of where each person was drafted? That way we can account for if we expected them to get 5% of the team's salary cap when they got their second contract and they actually got 10%, that's, better than expected. So to do that, we made a metric called salary score. If you're interested in the math of salary score, here's how it is. But basically the goal is to answer the question, how much better than expected did your paycheck look like on that second contract? That way we can account for when the player was drafted. And if we redo that chart with those new numbers, immediately what jumped out to me was the fact that the right guard and center positions skyrocketed to the top of this list. That means that on average, the right guards and centers that were drafted in the first round tended to get paid more than what we would have expected them to get based on when they were being selected. That doesn't mean that you should take a right guard first overall, but what that means is if the average right guard is going 18th, then typically that right guard tends to get paid more than a usual 18th overall pick. But there are two important things to note. First of all, the upside of these two positions is clearly much more limited than the upside of some of these more flashy positions like wide receiver or defensive end, right? Like the best right guards and centers are right here, and the best wide receivers are right here. And sometimes people are drafting for upside, even if the typical player is a little bit worse. And the second limitation is that we have sample size issues. There were only 9 right guards and 7 centers drafted in the first round during this entire 11-year span, so it's not like that box is being made by a bunch of guys. But let's talk quarterbacks, because what's interesting here is that they have actually dropped down quite a bit on this chart relative to where they were initially, which actually means that the median quarterback gets paid a little bit less than what we would expect them to get paid based on when they usually get drafted. And that aligns with what we were talking about, right? Like, quarterbacks are getting drafted in the top 5. Those guys are getting paid. Well, maybe quarterbacks getting drafted in the top 5 might not be getting paid as much as everybody else getting drafted in the top 5. So am I saying that quarterbacks don't matter and that you shouldn't draft them in the top 5? Well, let me show you another way of looking at this. And also, before we move on from this chart, I know you're wondering, who are the 2 outlier points that show up here? Well, this one is none other than TJ Watt. He got a 15% cut of the pie with the second contract, when usually the 30th overall pick got closer to 3 or 4%. And that one right there, the ultimate outlier, is Lamar Jackson, whose 23% cut of the pie when he signed his second contract was a full 5 times bigger than what we would usually see from someone drafted at the end of the first round. But okay, back to the quarterbacks. Again, looking at it, they dropped lower in the rankings, and it also looks like the typical quarterback is actually getting paid a little bit less than what we would expect based on when they usually get drafted. But these lines represent the median, and I know you didn't expect that word median to matter again when I said it at the start of this video, but it matters because the median does not account for outliers. If we take this set of numbers and we take this set of numbers, they have the same median. But if you take the average average or the mean, obviously these guys are not the same. And football, I think, in my opinion, kind of works more like the average than it does like the median. Because you could have a really bad player, and at the end of the day, all that's going to happen is you're not going to sign him, and that lowest possible value is 0. But what is a superstar worth? Well, a superstar is worth, all the way over here on the right. It will break the scale like Lamar Jackson did. And unfortunately, this chart right here, Lamar Jackson right here and Patrick Mahomes at the end of the whisker, these guys don't really get to properly influence the median, but they will influence the mean. So let's switch it up. Let's just take the mean salary score for each position and plot that. And now we are left with this. Finally, after all these different approaches, the quarterbacks come out right back on top. What this means is that on average, using the mean, not the median, on average, a quarterback does actually outperform and get paid bigger on that second contract than what we would expect given when they were drafted. Now again, that's largely being driven by a couple key outliers like Lamar Jackson and Patrick Mahomes, who really balled out and got paid because they're quarterbacks. So sure, the median quarterback is actually slightly negative, but at the end of the day, you have to be exceptional to win a Super Bowl. And right now it looks like the best way to be exceptional is to draft a quarterback that ends up becoming a star and is worth that money, which again is not surprising to you. Unfortunately, I do think a lot of coaches and GMs are drafting not to lose or not to get fired rather than to win. So I don't know if someone would have the guts to take a really high-risk quarterback like in the top 3 overall when they could take a safer interior defensive lineman that you know is going to perform well. But at the end of the day, if you want the upside, if you want the Patrick Mahomes and Lamar Jacksons of the world, you got to draft a quarterback. So as a final offering to you, I will leave you this table. This shows each position and how many of each position was drafted during this data set, and then the mean salary score for that position group, and then the median salary score for that position group. So what's the final takeaway here? Again, if I had a top 5 pick and this was in Madden to where I knew I wouldn't get fired, I'm drafting a quarterback early every time. Honestly, I'm probably drafting, and I know nobody would do this, but I'm probably drafting a quarterback, seeing if they're legit within 2 or 3 years, and if they're not, I'm trading them so I could draft another one. And I will say, if I'm picking in the mid to late parts of the first round, give me an interior defensive lineman or a good left tackle. Those seem to be kind of known quantities based on how many of them were drafted and how many of them tend to get paid relative to when they are actually drafted. And finally, I have no choice but to avoid running backs at all costs. And with Ashton Jeanty in this draft, that might have to be a topic for a whole nother video. Until then, let me know what you think about this, if you agree, disagree, if this is interesting, or if I just told you exactly what you already knew. Either way, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Peace out.